Hello, America. This is Life, Liberty, and Levin. I'm Mark Levin. It's a pleasure to have you. Professor Burton Folsom, it's an honor. How are you?
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here with you.
You're an expert on Franklin Roosevelt, the progressives. We see Bernie Sanders now taking the lead, even though it's not strong, but still, there's a percentage of the population that supports him. He calls himself a democratic socialist, which is kind of strange considering socialism is autocratic, and it's hard to mix Democrat with autocratic, but nonetheless. And we just went through this impeachment trial in which the House managers were going on and on about abuse of power. And I'm thinking of Bernie Sanders, I'm thinking of abuse of power, and what comes to my mind is Franklin Roosevelt.
Yes.
The great hero today of the radical Democrat progressive movement. Every person running for president thinks FDR on the Democrat side is their great hero, not Washington, not Lincoln, FDR. You're an expert on FDR. Now, let me ask you a few questions.
Sure.
When I think of FDR, I think of abuse of power on many, many levels. Am I wrong?
No, correct.
And give us some examples broadly, and then we'll move into some specifics. He abused power. How long was he president?
Well, he was elected 4 times. Although he died in his 4th term, he was president for a little over 12 years.
And that was a break with the past, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Because Washington set the 2 terms.
Right.
And everybody followed that. But Franklin, you know, Woodrow Wilson was a big progressive. Frankly, Theodore Roosevelt was a big progressive. Yes. But Franklin Roosevelt is different. Why is he different?
He's different because he went farther, and also he was less principled, for example, than Teddy Roosevelt. He went farther because he mastered the whole concept, we call it now quid pro quo, kind of a tit for tat, but of he will give subsidies to various voting groups, targeting voting groups. And then those voting groups in turn vote for him, and the Democratic Party becomes a coalition of groups, many of which are receiving federal subsidies from the federal government. The Republicans, of course, have an idea of more limited government, and then with a prosperous economy, the rising tide, it will lift all boats, and then America will prosper that way. Roosevelt did not accept that.
So Franklin Roosevelt really built the modern-day Democrat Party.
He did.
And he did it by pulling together these disparate groups.
Yes.
And you're saying he did it not just by trying to appeal to them, but by subsidizing them and subsidizing areas of the country. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, with farmers, for example, it was the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The whole concept of paying farmers not to produce is incredible, but it certainly is one that effectively brought in a lot of farmers into the fold. He relied on a lot of progressive thinkers in his programs. In the case of the AAA, it was college professors that helped design that. But he thought if we pay farmers not to produce, that will help farm income. And then we, in turn, ask the farmers to not plant on some of their land, then we won't have as much overproduction. But remember, America is starving. We have millions of people who are in desperate trouble. And to have farmers paid not to produce is not going to be a solution to that problem. But it is effective in getting farm groups to vote for him.
Which is what happened.
Which is what happened.
And also, he was extraordinarily political in terms of the federal largesse that he gave out, correct?
Correct.
He looked at the states, he looked at the counties, he looked at what would benefit him and his party. Give us some examples.
Well, yes. The WPA, for example, which
What was that?
Well, that was a federal program, the Works Progress Administration, to subsidize people who might be unemployed, to build roads, perhaps even schools, other kinds of buildings. And that, his argument was, would reduce unemployment. But of course, the problem is that it takes tax revenue to operate these programs. Well, that means for every dollar that you're paying someone to build a road, you're taking a dollar from someone else. And therefore, the result is really a redistribution of income, Mark, not really a creation of jobs. And that's why, really, in 1939, after Roosevelt had been in office for almost 7 years, unemployment was still over 20%.
And how did he allocate these funds? What was it based on? Pure need?
No, it wasn't. And it's first of all, there's a timeliness to it. The projects ran strongest right before election time. They were cut back after elections because you didn't need the votes anymore. Sometimes WPA people, instead of building roads, did campaigning for Franklin Roosevelt during October. You usually had to be a member of the Democratic Party to get a job. Not always, but often. And we see this from primary sources from New Jersey and other states, where Frank Hague, who was head of the WPA in New Jersey, would answer his telephone, Democrat headquarters. You would have congressmen, you would have to show that you had ties and an in the Democratic Party. Then you would have an opportunity to be employed on the WPA. And of course, once you're there, you are a political appointee, which means that you're not likely to get fired for incompetence. And so some of these projects were very poorly built. Some were well built, but some were not.
And did he use the federal largesse in these programs to affect the outcomes in elections in various counties, in various states, and how so?
That was often the intent of it. In fact, we have records for our county, which counties received how much money, and how
And
they
you've
vote.
looked at this?
Yes.
And what did you see?
Yes. The magazine editor, David Lawrence, wrote a study on that, and I used that in my book, New Deal or Raw Deal.
And what did you find?
Well, there's a strong correlation. Those counties that received the most money also voted most heavily for Franklin Roosevelt. Those counties that received very little in the way of federal money often voted Republican. Pennsylvania, your home state, is a key one in this because Pennsylvania had not been carried by a Democrat since James Buchanan. In other words, Hoover carried it even in 1932, running against Roosevelt. He felt that if he could dislodge Pennsylvania from the Republican Party, and Illinois too, which was often Republican as well, that would become the base of a future Democratic Party that would triumph. And so he spent a lot of effort to get Pennsylvania and Illinois dislodged from the Republican Party. For example, the first federal welfare program, which ultimately was administered by Roosevelt, almost 1/3 of all the federal funds that were in this first welfare program went to Illinois or Pennsylvania. The rest of the nation got the rest, and some states like Massachusetts got zero.
Did he work? Did he flip the states?
Yes, he flipped the states. He flipped Pennsylvania. And when you look at it, those counties in Pennsylvania that received little or no federal funding voted Republican.
These are quid pro quo type activities.
Quid pro quo activity.
Get money, turn out the vote.
Right.
And not political money, government tax dollars.
That's correct.
So when you're watching the impeachment trial and you're hearing about quid pro quo, abuse of power, are you thinking to yourself, as I am, under this test, how in the world would Franklin Roosevelt survive?
Franklin Roosevelt operated in a quid pro quo setting almost every day of his presidency during the 1930s. And it was accepted by the Democratic Party that that's the way it would work. In fact, they campaigned on quid pro quo. President Roosevelt kept careful records of which money went into which congressman. And of course, congressmen were competing for this money, even within the Democratic Party, so they wanted to be loyal to Roosevelt to get the money. But the point is, when they went into the campaign, they would announce in their campaign advertising all the programs and all the money that had come in as a result of their connections with Franklin Roosevelt. The Republican would be caught saying, well, I favor limited government, and then the voters would say, well, what are you going to do for us? This other fellow has brought in these WPA projects, maybe other kinds of bridges and federal contributions. What have you done for us? And it changed the American political debate in the 1930s. The Republicans have really never quite been able to recover and respond to that approach.
So the modern Democrat Party is built on infinite quid pro quo deals.
That's what you could distill it into, and Franklin Roosevelt was the master of it.
And then he builds this massive bureaucratic state, this administrative state, which we call the swamp, many of us, or
Yes.
this enshrined bureaucracy, as an appendage, really, of the Democrat Party. It serves the interests of the Democrat Party, and the Democrat Party serves the interests of this massive bureaucratic state.
Yes.
Which is why a President Trump or past Republicans who wanted to address it have had these obstacles, these battles, because, and this is also why the Democrat Party jumps to their defense, that is, of the bureaucracy. That they view, that's their property, that's their bureaucracy. They built it, and it exists to advance this massive progressive agenda.
Right. Occasionally, you will get a Republican president that tries to buck this a little bit. President Nixon at one time was talking with John Ehrlichman, his advisor, and he said, why don't we get into the IRS and start auditing these Democrats? We need to use this to our advantage.
Which Roosevelt had done,
Correct.
which Kennedy had done, which LBJ had done, and Nixon does it, and
Nixon was not able to
they impeach him, or try to
get
impeach
away
him.
with it.
Yeah.
Right.
They
right.
go after. In fact, that's very interesting that you would raise that, because they talk about Nixon, Nixon, Nixon. Was it not Franklin Roosevelt who used the IRS against publishers in some cases?
Yes, the IRS was an effective weapon of Franklin Roosevelt, using it not only against Andrew Mellon, the Pennsylvania banker,
And the Treasury Secretary.
and the Treasury
Coolidge. Yeah.
Secretary, who favored tax rate cuts. The tax rate cuts contributed dramatically to the prosperity of the 1920s. Roosevelt wanted the high taxes in there, the high tax rates, and lifted those tax rates, promoted them to very high rates, ultimately to 94% of all your income over.
Sounds like Bernie Sanders.
Yes. All the income over $200,000. He didn't have a wealth tax as Bernie Sanders has, but he did have a which is more than Bernie has advocated. 94% on all income over $200,000 was law when Roosevelt died.
But when we come back, I want to discuss this issue, this abuse of power, the quid pro quo issues, but also this massive Leviathan that Roosevelt built, that Bernie Sanders wants to massively increase beyond what Roosevelt did, and how this leads to really police state tactics, abuse of powers, post-constitutional governance. And I think people really need to understand this. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget, most weeknights you can watch me on Levin TV. Go to blazetv.com/Mark to sign up, blazetv.com/Mark, or give us a call at 844-LEVIN-TV. That's 844-LEVIN-TV.